Children don't speak in court, the prosecutor sneered, but Amara stood anyway. They said she was too young to understand, too small to fight, too innocent to see how deep corruption could go. Yet on that cold February morning in a Brooklyn courtroom, little Amara Thompson, 10 years old, brown-eyed braids still fresh from Sunday night, rose with a folder clutched tight in her hands. The silence was stiff-charged, like the air before a storm. Her grandmother, Evelyn Thompson, sat slumped beside her attorney, her spirit nearly crushed by the weight of a crime she hadn't committed. 74 years old, a retired nurse, and community pillar accused of stealing from the very housing program she once helped build. But Evelyn's real crime. She was black, elderly, and easy to blame. The law wasn't built to listen to girls like Amara, but that day the system cracked. It's a story about justice, but not the kind you read about in textbooks. It's the kind that's born in libraries, whispered in living rooms, and carried in the courage of a child with nothing to lose but her truth. But before we begin, how are you feeling today? Taking care of yourself, I hope. All right then, let's sit down together and open up the full story behind Amara and the trial that shook Brooklyn. The Thompson family had lived in the Brownsville section of Brooklyn since the early 1960s. The streets were cracked, the corner stores weathered, and the buildings carried the wear of generations. But inside apartment 5C of the Langston Towers housing project, there was warmth. Home, a kind of sacred comfort that only comes from hand-sewn curtains, photo albums stacked under the TV, and the smell of lavender oil mixed with slow-cooked oxtails. Evelyn Thompson, or Miss Evie as the neighborhood called her, was well known. Retired nurse, Bible study leader, the kind of woman who'd show up to school board meetings with a Tupperware full of cornbread, just to make sure people sat long enough to hear her talk. She had raised 3 sons, buried one, and taken in her granddaughter Amara when her daughter passed away from lupus 5 years ago. Nobody had ever questioned Evelyn's honesty. Not until now. The project she was accused of embezzling from wasn't just any public initiative. It was one she helped pioneer, Keys to Home, a program created in the early 2000s to help single mothers in public housing transition into first-time home ownership. Evelyn had volunteered as a community coordinator for over a decade, helping families navigate credit repair, down payment assistance, and neighborhood mentorship. That program had changed lives, and now they were saying she stole from it. It began with a knock at the door one Friday morning. Evelyn was stirring her tea, humming an old Aretha Franklin tune, when 2 men in suits stood outside the peephole. One of them, stern-faced and salt-haired, flashed a badge. "Evelyn Thompson," he asked, clipboard in hand. "You're being investigated for misappropriation of federal funds." Her hands trembled as she opened the door. By Monday, word had spread through the building. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, others whispered in the hallways. A letter from the housing authority stated she was temporarily suspended from all volunteer duties. Her church friends called but didn't stay long on the phone. Everyone was afraid. When the formal charge arrived, embezzlement of $18,000 from the Keys to Home budget, Evelyn nearly collapsed. But the worst part wasn't the charge. It was the tone of it, like it had already been decided. The prosecutor assigned to the case, Gerald Monroe, had built his career on quick wins and flashy headlines. White, sharp-suited, and political to the bone, he saw Evelyn's case as an easy notch before his upcoming campaign for borough attorney. To him, this was just paperwork and PR. What he didn't expect, what no one expected, was Amara. Amara Thompson was 10, but nobody ever told her to act her age. She was curious, stubborn, and carried herself with the same quiet dignity as her grandmother. Books were her escape and her weapon. She spent most afternoons at the Fulton Street Library digging through science journals and learning how to code on the community computer. The librarians adored her, especially Grace Miller, a 50-something woman with gray streaked locks and a worn-out denim tote bag full of legal textbooks. Grace had once been a paralegal for a small civil rights firm before budget cuts pushed her into early retirement. She found purpose again at the library, helping kids with research and coaching them through school projects. When she saw Amara curled up one afternoon reading Intro to Forensics, she leaned in. "You trying to be a detective, baby girl?" Amara didn't answer. She just held up the book and said, "I need to prove my grandma's innocent." Grace raised an eyebrow. "Then let's get to work." Over the next 4 weeks, while the news cycles speculated about the case and prosecutors smiled for cameras outside the courthouse, a child and a librarian quietly built a defense. Amara combed through Evelyn's journals, meticulously kept for years, and cross-referenced dates and names with public housing databases. She requested public records, taught herself handwriting analysis from a DIY forensic guide, and started matching signatures. Grace coached her on questioning techniques and courtroom etiquette. She even borrowed a tape recorder from the library's AV room. Every night after dinner, Amara and Evelyn would sit in the living room and go over the files. Evelyn couldn't believe the depth of her granddaughter's work. "You don't have to do this," she'd say, voice cracking. "You're just a child." And every time Amara would whisper the same thing, "Then let me be a child who changes something." Across town in a sleek office with a view of the East River, Gerald Monroe had no idea what was coming. His staff had barely vetted the documents presented to them, receipts from fake companies' generic payment logs. He figured no one would question him. The court date was set for February 14th, Valentine's Day. Another reason he joked to his assistant to bury this old love story. But Brooklyn didn't belong to Monroe. Not really. It belonged to people like Evelyn, who'd scrubbed floors and filed housing complaints and saved up 20 in envelopes for emergencies. It belonged to girls like Amara, who read truth off of microfilm and believed that facts could stand taller than power. By the time the trial began, Evelyn's court-appointed lawyer was unprepared and overwhelmed. But Amara, sitting quietly with her backpack, had memorized every page of her presentation. She carried no illusions about how people saw her, just a girl, just a kid. But she also knew something nobody in that room was ready to admit. Sometimes justice doesn't wear a suit. So when the moment came when the prosecutor made a snide remark about childish interference, Amara rose. Not in anger, not in panic, but with a sense of purpose that filled the room like thunder before a downpour. The courtroom didn't know it yet, but the world was about to change. Amara's unexpected presence in court set off a quiet buzz, not just in the chamber, but in the hallways, lobbies, and courthouse stairwells. Spectators leaned forward, murmuring. Reporters took hurried notes. Prosecutor Monroe cocked his head and gave her a look like one might give a squirrel suddenly appearing at a Sunday picnic. Mild annoyance, amusement, a hint of danger. "Your Honor," he said with a smug smirk, "this isn't a talent show." Judge Harold Whitman, old and weary from 3 decades on the bench, adjusted his glasses. His voice was sandpaper dry but patient. "She's family. Let her speak." Monroe scoffed but leaned back in his chair, confident no child could cause him trouble. Amara stood trembling slightly at the knees. She cleared her throat and lifted a manila folder. "I don't represent the law," she began, her voice steadying with every word. "I just want to tell the truth." That 5-minute window changed everything. She presented a series of receipts, all connected to companies supposedly contracted for consulting services under the Housing Programs Fund. She pointed out inconsistencies in logos, mismatched billing addresses, and most critically, signatures that didn't match Evelyn's handwriting. She held up a side-by-side comparison she'd printed at the library, Evelyn's real signature on medical forms versus the forged ones on the alleged contracts. There was no denying the difference. The courtroom shifted. Whispers became murmurs. The judge leaned forward. But Monroe wasn't rattled yet. When the court recessed for lunch, he approached the press with a polished grin. "We've seen theatrics today, nothing that proves innocence. Let's focus on facts." Still, his voice betrayed a subtle crack. Behind the scenes, Monroe was under pressure. His upcoming re-election depended on portraying himself as tough on fraud and waste. The Thompson case had seemed like a freebie, low-resistance, high-visibility, but Amara's presentation threatened the narrative. His assistant, a young intern named Daniel, nervously tugged at his sleeve. "Sir, you want me to look into those receipts again just to be sure?" Monroe waved him off. "It's handled." But it wasn't. The next day, Amara returned, this time with an old tape recorder tucked inside her backpack. It was from the library, a relic from the 90s. She had practiced with grace the night before, recording herself and playing it back until her delivery was precise. She had more than handwriting analysis now. She had patterns. She revealed how each payment was made on the same date, always the 28th of the month, and always just under the reporting threshold for external audits. A pattern too neat to be coincidence. If Grandma did this, Amara said, why did all the documents use the same computer font, the same scanner ID, and the same filing cabinet tag, even when the dates are years apart? Monroe's jaw clenched. Objection. She's not a legal expert. She's an expert in common sense, the judge replied. From there, the courtroom began to turn. One of the jurors, an older black woman with short gray hair and a church hat tucked discreetly beside her purse, began nodding with each of Amara's points. Another juror took notes furiously. Evelyn's court-appointed lawyer, flustered and outpaced, finally began to re-engage, asking questions Amara had planted in his notes the night before. But Monroe wasn't done. That night, Monroe did what people in power often do when cornered. He tried intimidation. Grace Miller was walking home from the library when a black sedan pulled up beside her. A man in a dark coat stepped out. "Be careful," he said. "You're not a lawyer anymore. Don't get involved." Grace stared him down. "You tell Monroe that little girl is more lawyer than he'll ever be." The next morning, Monroe filed a motion to exclude any future testimony from Amara. He claimed the court was being manipulated by sentiment. He called her a media prop. Judge Whitman called recess. The courtroom went quiet. Inside the hallway, Evelyn sat, slumped, tears in her eyes. "Maybe it's time we stop, baby," she whispered to Amara. "This fight is too big, too dangerous." Amara looked up at her. "Nana, if we stop now, that means they win without having to lie again." It was Evelyn's turn to be still. Then slowly she nodded. "Okay." The next day, Amara came back with something even more shocking: photographs. pulled from community events flyers and even Facebook posts. Amara had tracked Evelyn's whereabouts during key dates when Monroe claimed the embezzlement occurred. At least 3 of those days, Evelyn was either at a neighborhood fundraiser or in church. One time she was in the hospital for a knee injection. Then came the real bombshell. Amara held up a flash drive. "Your Honor, I have a recording." Monroe's eyes widened. The courtroom clerk plugged it into the system. The speakers crackled. Then came the unmistakable sound of Monroe's voice recorded during a phone call in his office. "I need to close this case quickly before the election. Who cares about that poor old lady? It's just one more number." Silence. It landed like a hammer blow. Monroe leapt to his feet. "That's illegally obtained audio." Judge Whitman raised a hand. "The court will verify its authenticity, but based on what we've seen, this case just changed." The court erupted. 2 days later, under increasing scrutiny, Monroe was removed from the case pending investigation. The audio was confirmed as real. An anonymous source, later revealed to be Daniel, the assistant, had leaked internal documents showing Monroe received kickbacks from a ghost company tied to the missing funds. That same company had received the payments Evelyn was accused of approving. Amara had dug deeper than anyone expected. She had asked a simple question that no one else had. Why would a woman who spent her life helping people suddenly steal? That single question unraveled Monroe's entire strategy. But the system, even when cornered, doesn't die quietly. That weekend, the local news ran a headline, "Child Crusader Disrupts Brooklyn Court." But was it legal? Monroe's allies tried to frame the case as vigilante justice gone wrong. Social media lit up. Some hailed Amara as a hero. Others called her a puppet. Evelyn tried to shield her from it. "You don't need to carry this weight, baby." But Amara stood firm. "I'm not carrying it. I'm passing it." Every day they walked back into that courtroom, they walked into history, and the world kept watching. They say justice turns slowly like a ship fighting the wind, but sometimes it turns all at once. That Tuesday morning, the Brooklyn courthouse was packed beyond capacity. Reporters lined the hallway, cell phones, raised eyes trained on the young girl in the yellow corduroy jacket who had become the unlikely face of a crumbling legal farce. Her name was trending nationwide, Amara of the system. She didn't know it yet. Grace wouldn't let her read the news, but adults were calling her the baby Thurgood. Inside the courtroom, something had changed. Judge Whitman arrived early. The bailiff's voice was clearer. The stenographer had a new pen. Even the air seemed sharper, like the system itself had been roused from sleep. Evelyn Thompson sat straighter now, her hands resting calmly in her lap. Her public defender, once sheepish and insecure, now stood taller beside her, fortified by Amara's discoveries and the flood of community support that poured in like a rising tide. And across the aisle, Gerald Monroe was unraveling. The morning session began with a review of the forensic evidence Amara had compiled, now submitted formally. By her attorney, bolstered with affidavits, Grace helped prepare. The documents included independent handwriting analysis from a volunteer retired police officer. No credible expert would authenticate the signatures, as Evelyn Thompson's his statement read. More damning was the evidence pulled from Monroe's own office. Daniel, the quiet assistant who had once only fetched coffee, now sat in the witness chair. Hands shaking, voice trembling but resolute, he spoke directly to the judge. "I was told to fabricate urgency," Daniel admitted. "Mr. Monroe said the media needed a case that showed results. We targeted Miss Thompson because her records were disorganized and her legal defense was weak. He said, and I quote, 'She's old and poor, nobody will care.'" The gallery gasped. The stenographer's hands froze mid-keystroke. Whitman looked up from his notes. "Mr. Monroe, do you wish to respond?" Monroe, red-faced and sweating, leaned forward. "This is slander. I've served this borough for 15 years with integrity." "With incentives," Amara said softly, interrupting him. Everyone turned to her. Judge Whitman didn't scold her. He waited. Amara stepped forward and held up a folder labeled "Follow the Money," a term Grace had taught her. Inside were photocopies of bank statements pulled from Monroe's campaign records, matched against deposits made by the ghost companies receiving housing funds. "You always said this case was about the law," Amara said, looking Monroe in the eye. "But it was about the money." And just like that, the illusion shattered. The prosecution's case fell apart like wet cardboard. Monroe fumbled with objections. He accused Amara and Grace of illegal discovery. He demanded mistrial, but it was too late. Judge Whitman overruled every plea, and by midday, Monroe was excused from court proceedings and escorted out quietly by 2 plainclothes agents from the Department of Justice. Outside the courtroom, the press swarmed. Monroe avoided the cameras, but the story was no longer his. It belonged to Amara now. That afternoon, Evelyn took the stand. For the first time, she didn't need to defend herself. She simply told the truth. "I didn't steal anything," she said, her voice thick with the grace of survival. "I gave my time, my energy, my old bones to that program. Not for praise, not for money, for dignity, for the mothers who deserved a chance. If helping people makes me a criminal, then you need to check your mirror." She held her granddaughter's gaze. "But it wasn't me who saved me. It was her." Then came Grace. When she took the stand, the gallery quieted like a chapel. She testified not only to Amara's research, but to the power of access, of public libraries, of mentorship, of what happens when a community defends its own. This little girl taught herself more law in 4 weeks than some folks do in 4 years, Grace said. And she did it because no one else would. By the time the defense rested, it no longer felt like a trial. It felt like a reckoning. Later that day, Judge Whitman gave his verdict. All charges against Evelyn Thompson are hereby dismissed. He said, voice calm but resolute. This court finds clear evidence of misconduct by the prosecution, forgery of official documents, and suppression of exculpatory material. Furthermore, the U.S. Attorney's Office will be notified of possible criminal behavior by former prosecutor Gerald Monroe. Cheers erupted. Evelyn wept silently, her hands shaking as Amara threw her arms around her waist. Grace held both of them. And yet amid the joy, there was silence in Monroe's old chair, an echo, a reminder. Because this wasn't just about winning. It was about everything that allowed the lie to begin in the first place. The following morning, the headlines weren't about Monroe's corruption. They were about Amara's courage. 10-year-old girl overturns corrupt case. Brooklyn's young hero speaks truth to power. The future of justice wears braids. Still, Evelyn insisted on a quiet celebration. No cameras, no fanfare, just dinner at home. Rice and peas, baked chicken, cream soda in paper cups. Grace brought banana pudding and neighbors dropped by to leave flowers and cards. Amara didn't ask for attention. She had seen enough of what attention brings. But that night she sat at the kitchen table long after the dishes were done, scribbling ideas on a napkin. We should teach other kids how to look stuff up, she told Grace. At the library, like a program or something. Grace smiled. Call it what? Amara thought a moment. The Amara Project. Grace nodded slowly. Then let's make it real. And they did. Within 3 months, the Amara Project was holding Saturday workshops in 2 local schools. By summer, it had expanded to 10. They taught basics: how to read a public budget, how to request records, how to fact-check a headline. Grace brought in retired lawyers. Evelyn served snacks. Amara stood at the front of every class, small but magnetic, like a conductor leading an orchestra of future voices. Brooklyn noticed. So did the country. By fall, a local council member introduced a bill called Amara's Law, requiring physical presence of all defendants in financial fraud cases and mandating review of all evidence before prosecution. It passed unanimously. Other cities followed. Amara still played basketball, she still watched cartoons, she still got her favorite seat at the library. But something had changed. Not just in her. In all of us. The day Monroe was sentenced, the clouds over Brooklyn hung low and heavy, like even the sky was holding its breath. It had been 6 weeks since the charges against Evelyn were dismissed. 6 weeks of headlines, praise, backlash, and reflection. The courtroom was different now, less about survival and more about reckoning. For once, the spotlight wasn't on Evelyn or even Amara. It was squarely on the man who had used his power like a blade, Gerald Monroe. He entered the courtroom with the swagger drained from his limbs, the confidence stripped clean off his face. His once crisp suits hung loose on him now, the color drained from his cheeks. No media team followed, no staff, no assistant. Just silence, and a man who thought the system would always protect him. Evelyn was there, sitting in the back row, dignified in a navy blue coat. Amara sat beside her, holding a notebook, and pencil legs swinging just above the floor. Grace Miller stood quietly behind them, arms crossed, eyes sharp. When Monroe stood to speak before sentencing, the court fell silent. I made mistakes, he said, voice low, but my intent was never to harm. I was under pressure. The system is flawed. I didn't. Judge Whitman cut him off with the soft slam of his gavel. Mr. Monroe, the system did not instruct you to fabricate evidence. It did not advise you to use a child's grandmother as a political pawn. That choice was yours. And now the consequences are yours too. The sentence was read: 8 years in federal prison with a recommendation for no parole due to abuse of public office and obstruction of justice. No celebration erupted, no applause, just a quiet exhale from Evelyn and a single tear that slid down her cheek. Monroe was let out in cuffs. Amara didn't look at him. She had already moved on. That evening, back at Langston Towers, Evelyn finally spoke the words she had held back for weeks. I thought they broke me, she said, sipping tea from a mug that read Blessed and Busy. I sat in that courtroom every day waiting to disappear. But you didn't let me. Amara smiled small and sure. You never disappeared. They just stopped looking. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. The Amara Project caught fire. Brooklyn public schools added legal literacy to their after-school curriculum. Grace partnered with a nonprofit to provide tablets and printing access to underserved kids. And Evelyn. She returned to the Keys to Home program not as a volunteer but as the chair of its new oversight board. Her first act was to request an independent audit of all housing fund cases from the past decade. A quiet storm rolled through City Hall. One Saturday, a letter arrived at the apartment. It was from Congresswoman Lillian Boone of New York's 9th District, inviting Amara to speak at the annual Justice and Equity Summit in Washington, D.C. Grace read it out loud, her voice catching slightly. Evelyn, meanwhile, just shook her head and laughed. Lord have mercy, she's not even in middle school yet. At the summit, Amara stood behind a podium that towered over her, reading from index cards she'd typed herself on Grace's library computer. She talked about libraries, about truth, about how corruption isn't always loud, it can be quiet, polite, wearing a tie. When you're a kid, they tell you the world is fair, she said, but then you watch what happens to your grandma, and you learn fast. Grown-ups don't always protect what's right, sometimes kids have to. The crowd rose to its feet. Back in Brooklyn, the impact rippled deeper than the headlines. Local high schoolers began organizing record-checking workshops. Mothers in Bed-Stuy formed a council to oversee evictions and court appearances. The city passed new legislation giving public defenders access to community research assistance, volunteer programs started by Grace's librarian network. Evelyn's name began appearing in grant proposals. Amara's in textbooks. But it wasn't all perfect. There were moments of pushback. Critics said Amara was being exploited, that her story was being overused. Conservative news pundits called her the face of weaponized innocence. One school board member tried to block the expansion of the Amara Project, claiming it politicized children. But every time someone tried to dismiss her, Amara showed up. Once during a board hearing, a white council member said it's not appropriate for a child to be given this kind of platform. It sends the wrong message. Amara stood hands behind her back and asked, "What message is that, telling the truth or not letting grown men lie in court?" The room fell silent. The measure passed. The story reached even further. A filmmaker from PBS began a documentary. A teacher in Oakland renamed her classroom library the Amara Corner. A group of middle school girls in Atlanta sent a hand-drawn banner that read, "Thank you for showing us we're powerful too." Through it all, Evelyn remained grounded. She refused interviews unless they included her whole team: Grace, the librarian staff, the retired detective who reviewed the signatures, and the janitor who found an envelope of old receipts that confirmed Amara's timeline. "Nobody does this alone," she'd say. "Don't make me into some symbol. I'm a woman who lived right and almost paid for it. But we're still here." And Amara, despite it all, remained a child. She played basketball on Sundays. She read mystery novels on the roof. She kept a journal of courtroom ideas next to a sketchbook of superhero outfits. She was still quick to laugh, still occasionally stubborn, still full of the wonder that comes from being too young to know just how much was against you and just brave enough not to care. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the towers, she sat on the steps with Grace eating frozen grapes out of a plastic bag. "You know what the scariest part was?" she asked. "What's that baby?" "I wasn't sure anybody would believe me." Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. "That's always the fight, Amara. Telling the truth is one thing. Getting the world to hear it, that's the real work." Amara looked out over the neighborhood. "Well, I'm not done yet." And none of them were. Not Grace, not Evelyn, not the kids now learning how to read court dockets, not the mothers tracking budget votes at City Hall, not the teachers adjusting their curriculum, not the neighbors who once whispered behind closed doors, but now stood together with open eyes. Because justice had started in one courtroom. But it didn't end there. Spring arrived quietly in Brooklyn. The harsh winds of winter softened into warm breezes that carried the smell of street vendors and the steady rhythm of kids jumping rope in the courtyards. In Langston Towers, the flowers Evelyn kept on her window ledge, 2 little pots of purple African violets, had begun to bloom again. Evelyn sat at the kitchen table, trimming the leaves with care. Her body moved slower these days, her hands not quite as steady. But her spirit unshaken, in fact stronger than ever. Every few days, someone new knocked at the door. A woman from down the hall with questions about a rent increase notice, a young man asking Evelyn to help translate a legal letter his mother couldn't read, a teacher with a flyer about school zoning changes. And Evelyn helped them all, no longer the accused, no longer the target, but the anchor, the matriarch, the witness who survived the storm and came back with a blueprint. Amara's world was shifting too. Her days were filled with more than courtrooms now. After school, she met with a rotating group of classmates in the back room of the library. Grace called it Legal Light Club, but the kids preferred Justice Crew. They practiced reading city ordinances, made posters about their tenant rights, and held mock trials using cartoon cases like the case of the stolen lunchbox. It was fun, but it was serious too. One of the girls, Sasha, shared how her uncle had been evicted without notice. Another boy, Terrell, said his older sister had been arrested for mistaken identity. Every story had something familiar, something broken. And Amara would listen, pencil in hand, writing down every name and date like it mattered, because it did. By summer, the Amara Project had expanded to 20 schools. The team, mostly volunteers, mostly women, worked day and night. Grace took on a supervisory role, juggling grant applications and new curriculum plans. A few retired attorneys joined to give workshops, and even Evelyn began running monthly living room law sessions in the rec room of their building. Folding chairs, dollar store cookies, handwritten notes, and wisdom that couldn't be taught in textbooks. One evening, Evelyn stood in front of a group of 20 people, some young, some old, mostly black and brown, explaining how to request a public record. Her voice cracked a bit when she told them, "I used to think you had to be someone to fight for yourself. Turns out you just have to believe you matter." That's it. Back in her apartment, Amara kept a special binder. On the front, she'd written in marker the truth file. It held every newspaper clipping about the trial, every thank you note from kids and teachers, every photo of her and Evelyn together in court. But it also had something else, a list. Just a plain, handwritten list of names. There were 42 names. These were the other elders Evelyn had once worked alongside through Keys to Home. Most were now in retirement homes or scattered across New York's boroughs, but something about them stayed with Amara. She had Grace help her track them down. She called it her follow-up project. Nobody asked her to do it, but something in her knew this story wasn't just about her Nana. One by one she called them. Some didn't answer. A few had passed away. But a good number welcomed her questions. They told her about their work, their memories, the times they fought for housing policies that kept single mothers from being pushed out of the city. Some of them had lost funding, some had been pushed out like Evelyn. One woman cried just hearing Evelyn's name. "I thought they buried her under those lies," she said. "I didn't know she made it out." Amara told them she didn't just make it out. She's building the road behind her. And soon something strange started happening. People who had never spoken at city council meetings started showing up. Tenants began recording their landlord visits. Churches started adding legal rights briefings to their Sunday announcements. Even public school students began organizing around lunchroom conditions, school bus access, and dress code policies. Tiny revolutions sparked by Amara's quiet courage. The whole city didn't change overnight, but it changed a little. And sometimes a little is all you need. In late May, Evelyn was honored at City Hall with a Community Service Award. She wore a soft cream dress, and Amara sat beside her in a floral skirt and sneakers. Councilwoman Boone handed her the plaque with a wide smile and whispered, "This is your redemption." Evelyn accepted it, but she didn't make a speech. She simply turned to the crowd and said, "We do this so the next one don't have to." And that was enough. Afterward, they walked to the Brooklyn Promenade. The city lights sparkled along the East River like promises made. Amara stood at the railing looking out across the water. "Do you think people will forget?" she asked softly. Evelyn looked at her. "People forget names, but they remember change. And you, Amara, you changed something real." Amara didn't answer. She just watched the ferry lights drift across the river like dreams moving slowly toward tomorrow. A few weeks later, Evelyn received a letter postmarked from upstate New York. It was from Monroe's assistant, Daniel. The letter was long, apologetic, honest. "I didn't have the courage you and your granddaughter did," it read. "But watching that trial, watching her stand up and do what we all failed to do, it changed something in me. I'm applying to law school next fall. I want to fight for the right side now." Evelyn passed the letter to Amara. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and slid it into her binder. 43 names now, she whispered. By early summer, kids from around the country began writing letters. Some had watched the PBS documentary. Others had heard about Amara's law. A group in Baltimore was creating a podcast called Justice Kids. A classroom in Chicago had named their debate team Team Thompson, and the library Amara's home base got a new sign outside Grace Miller Youth Law Resource Center. Grace cried the day they unveiled it. "I was just trying to help one girl," she said, wiping her cheeks. "But I forgot what happens when you help a girl like that. She turns around and saves the whole neighborhood." And in a way she had. Langston Towers still had its cracked sidewalks and creaky elevators, but now it also had a bulletin board listing community laws, a rotating team of youth researchers and neighbors who looked out for each other with new eyes. The world didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to be possible. Amara, now nearly 11 and a half, began writing her own stories. Fiction. But in every tale, there was a girl who didn't wait for permission to speak, a grandmother who knew the weight of silence, and a city learning to listen. Change doesn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it's the hum beneath a city's surface, the unseen shifting of people who no longer accept what they once swallowed in silence. And in Brooklyn, the hum had grown into a song. A year had passed since the trial. The city, though still gritty and chaotic, held a different kind of rhythm, now more alert, more watchful, more participatory. The Amara Project had gone national. It started with one email from a librarian in Newark, New Jersey, asking if Amara's legal learning kits could be printed and shared with their after-school program. Then came requests from Detroit, Oakland, Atlanta, Memphis. Grace and a team of retired educators launched a digital toolkit, printable flashcards, simplified guides to tenant law community budget breakdowns, and examples of how kids could document, ask questions, and most importantly, speak up. Within 6 months, the site had 40,000 downloads. They called it kidjustice.org because justice, they insisted, doesn't have a minimum age requirement. Meanwhile, Evelyn returned to her routine only now with a few more meetings, interviews, and board seats under her belt. She traveled more, speaking on panels about elder rights and housing equity, but she always came home to Langston Towers. "I don't want the penthouse," she told one reporter. "I want my people to know I never left." One afternoon, she received a phone call from an executive at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. They wanted to replicate Keys to Home nationwide and name the model after her. She declined. "I'm honored," she said, "but name it after the mothers. They're the ones who stayed when the city left." Still, the work continued. Evelyn began teaching policy courses at the local community college twice a week. She'd arrive with a cane in one hand and a folder of case studies in the other. Don't just read the law, she'd tell her students, ask who it forgot. Amara, now in middle school, had adjusted to the glow of her name becoming more than just her own. Strangers would stop her in the bodega and say, "Hey baby, you still changing the world." A few kids at school teased her, called her Court, TV, or Little Miss Lawyer. But Amara didn't flinch. She had seen worse than name-calling. She'd stood against the system and made it blink. What surprised her, though, was the letters. They came in bundles, hundreds, sometimes thousands. One from a 9-year-old in Birmingham who convinced her school to review its detention policy. Another from a 12-year-old in Sacramento who exposed misuse of student funds using his math class budget sheet. A teacher in Tulsa wrote, "Your courage reminded my students that we can question authority and we must." The most touching came from a grandmother in Charleston, South Carolina. "They told me I was crazy for fighting my eviction. But I remembered Evelyn. I remembered Amara. I remembered truth." Amara kept them all in a box under her bed, her secret armor. But even with the attention, she tried to keep one foot in the normal. She still watched cartoons before bed, still went to sleepovers, still played basketball, though the local league had to start turning away reporters. One day during practice, her coach pulled her aside. "You ever think about going into politics, kid?" Amara tilted her head. "Why?" "Because people already believe in you. That's the hard part." She smiled but didn't answer. Amara wasn't interested in running for anything, not yet. She was interested in preparing others to run. She had seen what happened when people without empathy got power. So she started something new, a podcast. Ask Amara, weekly episodes, 15 minutes each. She'd answer real questions from kids. What do I do if a teacher won't listen? Is it okay to say no to police if I didn't do anything? How can we fix broken stuff in our school without getting in trouble? Grace edited the audio. Evelyn handled the emails, and kids listened, not just in Brooklyn, but all over. Because it wasn't just about law. It was about agency. The story of Evelyn's arrest and Amara's stand made its way into school libraries, documentaries, and even one fictionalized version in a best-selling middle-grade novel called The Girl in Courtroom 5. The author sent Amara an autographed copy. She laughed reading it. "They made me wear glasses in the book." But beneath the giggles was a knowing nod. She was becoming a symbol, something she never asked to be, but never shied away from. One quiet morning, Grace and Amara walked through Prospect Park. Grace, slower, now leaned on her cane while Amara walked ahead and doubled back every few steps. "Do you think this will last?" Amara asked. "The changes the laws." Grace looked toward the sky. "Not unless folks like you keep watching." "That's the part that scares me," Amara admitted. Grace stopped walking and turned to her. "Baby, it's not your job to carry the whole world. It's your job to carry the truth as far as you can, then pass it." Amara nodded slowly, like a baton. "Exactly." They sat on a bench near the lake. Ducks drifted across the water. The city moved around them, its sirens, strollers, subways, and saxophone players. It was still flawed, still complicated, still alive. "You know," Grace said, "we might have stopped one bad man. But the real enemy? What?" "Silence. That's what lets people like Monroe do what they do." Amara didn't respond right away. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folder labeled Next Steps. It was filled with notes on food insecurity, school zoning loopholes, and juvenile court reform. She handed it to Grace. "I'm not going to be quiet." Grace smiled. "Didn't think you would." Across Brooklyn and beyond, the ripples widened. Elderly residents were organizing building councils. Kids were testifying at school board meetings. Librarians were getting budget boosts after years of being ignored. Public defenders were citing Amara's law in court. And maybe most beautifully, communities that had once felt powerless were rising, not just because they had a hero, but because they realized they could be their own. Because of a little girl who stood up in a courtroom and said, "I just want to tell the truth." Every once in a while, a story reminds us that the system can be challenged not by wealth, not by title, but by truth. This was one of those stories. A 10-year-old girl named Amara Thompson stood up in a courtroom not because anyone gave her permission, but because she saw something wrong and knew in her bones that silence would betray her grandmother. Her words didn't come from law school. They came from love, from watching injustice up close, from walking the worn carpet of a Brooklyn library and finding power between the pages of a book. And that's the heart of it, isn't it? Real justice doesn't start in a courtroom. It starts in living rooms, classrooms, churches, subways, community centers, front porches. It starts when someone asks a question they were told they had no right to ask. It continues when we listen. You may not know a child like Amara, but you've heard her voice. Maybe it was your daughter, your neighbor's grandson, that bright kid who always speaks up in class even when it's uncomfortable. The truth is, there are thousands of Amaras out there, curious, brave, brilliant. But what they need isn't a miracle. It's support. It's someone to tell them you matter. Keep going. And maybe like Evelyn, you've been pushed to the margins, labeled, doubted, silenced. If so, let this story be your reminder you are not forgotten. You are not invisible, and your fight, your dignity still holds weight. So what do we do now? We build. We protect our libraries. We invest in our children. We question our systems. We show up. And when the time comes, we stand not for attention, not for applause, but because standing is the only thing left when sitting means surrender. If this story moved, you don't let it end here. Leave a comment. What part of Amara's journey resonated with your own experience? Share it because someone you know might be waiting to hear that it's okay to speak up. Like and follow the Black Women channel because stories like this aren't exceptions. They are reminders of who we are and what we've always been capable of. And most of all, believe that justice belongs to all of us, no matter our age, our skin, or our zip code. Amara once said, "When you know you're right and you don't give up, justice will come whether you're a 10-year-old or not." She wasn't just talking to a judge. She was talking to all of us.